Imagine a place where the earth breathes death, where the air is so heavy that animals drop lifeless, where the ground splits open in deep cracks like forgotten wounds. In ancient times, they didn't say these were just strange caves or springs. They said they were gates, real entrances to a realm of shadows, places so sacred and so forbidden that only the brave or the desperate dared to cross them. What lay on the other side? Spirits, dark gods, eternal punishments, secrets no one was meant to know. But even though we tried to seal them, to forget them, those portals are still there. In jungles, deserts, caves, and ruins that still whisper stories of sacrifices and warnings. Today, we're going to open those doors, to look into their shadows, to discover why so many different cultures shared the same terror. Because behind every myth lies an ancient fear, a warning we've forgotten. And you, would you dare to enter with me? Welcome to Divine Code. What are the gates to the underworld, really? They are more than cracks in the rock or dark caverns. They are thresholds marked by fear and faith, where the ancients said the world of the living and the dead touched. Caves so deep they seemed endless. Sacred cenotes whose waters hid offerings, and bones for insatiable gods. Sulphurous fissures exhaling poisonous vapors, with a breath they called the breath of the underworld. For many cultures, these gates weren't just physical entrances, but symbols of the ultimate passage. Places of trial, of communication with spirits, of crossing between dimensions. They are both warnings and promises at once. The promise of forbidden power or knowledge, and the warning of an impossible price to pay. Real places where the earth itself seemed to remind us. There are things that shouldn't be crossed. But these gates to the underworld weren't just an abstract idea. They weren't only poetic metaphors or stories to scare children. We find them described in sacred texts, carved into ancient myths, marked on spiritual maps of very different cultures. And if we want to understand why they fascinate us so much, we have to look at how the peoples who came before us imagined them. Let's begin with one of the oldest and most enigmatic, the biblical world, and its silent gate into the shadows, Sheol. Biblical dimension, Sheol, Sheol. An ancient name that still sounds like a dark whisper. For the Hebrews of the Old Testament, Sheol wasn't a fiery hell. There were no demons with tridents or eternal flames. It was much more unsettling in its simplicity, a realm of shadows, of absolute silence, of oblivion. It was described as a deep pit, a bottomless abyss that swallowed both the righteous and the wicked alike. No one could escape. No one could return to tell what they had seen. In Isaiah 38:10 we read, "I will go to the gates of Sheol." Imagine that. Gates, sealed, heavy, inescapable. A final threshold everyone knew they would one day have to cross. In Job 17:16, it's even darker. Will it not go down with me to Sheol? Shall we descend together into the dust? A vision where death spares no hierarchy, grants no glory. But was it only a metaphor? Some later traditions began dividing Sheol into regions, a place of comfort for the righteous, torment for the wicked, the seed of the idea of heaven and hell. But originally, it was the great equalizer, a kingdom of shadows spoken of with fear. A place no one knew, but everyone dreaded. And it's unsettling to think, did they imagine it as a physical place? Some cave, some real abyss that inspired those images? Or is it that all of us, in all cultures, feel the same chill when we look into the unknown? And wonder what doors will open when we close our eyes? But Sheol wasn't the only vision of death and its threshold. In other corners of the ancient world, those gates took different forms, more elaborate, more ritualistic, more terrifying. Where the Hebrews saw a pit of silence, the Greeks imagined an underground kingdom inhabited by relentless gods, guardians, and trials. a place so real to them that they claim to know its entrances in the very earth. Now let's descend together into that other vision of the afterlife, Hades. The Greek Hades, gates and rites. Hades. For the Greeks, it wasn't just the name of a god. It was the realm of the dead itself, a vast, shadowy underground domain from which no one could escape. But it wasn't an abstract place. For them, it had real entrances, sacred sites that marked the passage between the world of the living and the dead. One of these gates was at Cape Tainaran, at the southern tip of the Peloponnese, a famous cave where rituals were performed to summon the dead. It was a feared and revered site, said to breathe the very breath of Hades himself. Another entrance was at Lake Avernus in Italy. Its name means without birds, because they said no bird could fly over its sulphurous waters without falling dead. The toxic vapors it emitted were seen as a sign of the underworld, a poisonous threshold between this world and the next. But they weren't only physical entrances. There were oracles of the dead, like the Necromanteon in Epirus. There, the living would descend through dark, labyrinthine passages to communicate with spirits. Many believe hallucinogenic gases or psychological techniques were used to induce visions, creating the sensation of genuine contact with the beyond. And there were the myths, like that of Orpheus and Eurydice, the story of the musician who descended into Hades to rescue his beloved. A journey filled with warnings, because crossing that boundary had a price, a test of faith, love, and obedience, and the risk of failing forever. For the Greeks, the gates to the underworld weren't mere metaphors. They were real, locatable, sacred, and terrifying. Reminders that death was a kingdom with its own rules, and that sometimes the living were far too eager to open its doors. But the gates to the underworld weren't just a Greek myth. On the other side of the world, in the dense jungles of Mesoamerica, another vision of the afterlife emerged. Wetter, deeper, thirstier for blood. Where the Greeks built oracular caves and poisonous springs, the Maya found their portals in clear yet deadly waterwells. Places where the earth opened not to whisper, but to devour. Let's now submerge ourselves in the dark waters of Xibalbá and the sacred cenotes that promised passage to the underworld. Mayan cenotes and Xibalbá. The very name sounds like a drowned whisper among roots and water. For the Maya, Xibalbá was the underworld, a subterranean realm inhabited by fearsome gods and lords of death. But it wasn't just a myth told around the fire. They saw its gates in very real places. The cenotes, massive natural waterwells that pierced the earth like open wounds. Waters so deep and clear they seemed like mirrors to another world. They weren't mere water reservoirs. They were sacred portals, living mouths of the underworld that demanded respect, and sometimes blood. Archaeologists have found offerings of jade and gold in these cenotes, cast in as payment to the gods dwelling in the depths. But they also found human bones, including those of children, a brutal reminder that the passage to Xibalbá wasn't free. According to the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Maya, Xibalbá wasn't just a realm of the dead. It was a place of deadly trials, houses filled with knives, rivers of blood, challenges meant to break the traveler's spirit. Only the most cunning could make it through. The rest were lost forever in its liquid shadows. For the Maya, the cenotes were living gates. Devastating, mysterious, places where the favor of the gods was bought with offerings, or with lives. Because not all gates to the underworld are dry or dusty. Some breathe beneath the water, waiting patiently for the next who dares to look inside. But not everyone saw the underworld as a bloodthirsty realm. While the Maya offered sacrifices to deep cenotes that devoured lives, other peoples imagined death as a much more complex journey. A journey full of gates, guardians, secrets, and trials, where it wasn't enough to give offerings. One had to learn sacred names, hidden roots, and powerful spells. Such was the case for the Egyptians. Now let's journey into the sands of the Nile and discover the Duat, their enigmatic underworld, their sacred books, and their sealed gates. Egypt, Duat and its gates. The Duat, that's what the ancient Egyptians called their underworld. But for them, it wasn't simply a realm of shadows or punishment. It was a complex territory with its own geography, fearsome guardians, and mysterious gates that had to be crossed to reach eternal life. The Egyptians didn't fear death as an end, but as a dangerous journey. Every night, even the god Ra, lord of the sun, descended into the Duat. He faced giant serpents, lakes of fire, and monsters of chaos before being reborn at dawn. This daily journey of the sun was a model for the human soul. To be reborn, one had to cross the darkness. To understand this world, the Egyptians left behind something extraordinary: the Book of the Dead. But its true name is even more revealing: the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It was a travel manual for the deceased, full of spells, prayers, and maps. "I know the secret door. I know the name of the guardian," the dead would recite, because the Duat was filled with locked gates, each guarded by a being with a terrifying name that had to be known to pass. Funerary texts like the pyramid texts and coffin texts are even older and show us a detailed map of the underworld. In them, the pharaoh or noble would recite magical words to bypass traps and monsters. Archaeological fact: in the Valley of the Kings, the tombs aren't simple holes. They are corridors carved with scenes of the Duat, showing rivers of fire, solar boats, gods, and demons. The Egyptians literally turned their tombs into three-dimensional maps of the other world. Even the walls of the sarcophagus were inscribed with protective spells, so the deceased would never get lost. For them, dying without knowing the way was the real punishment, being trapped forever in the darkness of the Duat. Fascinating curiosity. In the Book of Gates, 12 gates are described, one for each hour of the night, with guardians demanding passwords. It was a spiritual code as strict as any physical lock. But the Duat wasn't only terror, it was also promise. If the soul overcame every trial, it reunited with the gods, transformed into a justified spirit, and lived eternally in the field of reeds, a paradise where there was no hunger or death. Isn't it unsettling to think that the Egyptians spent centuries perfecting these guides? That they built temples, tombs, and papyri, not just to honor the dead, but to teach them how to find the way out at dawn? For them, death wasn't the end. It was a labyrinth of locked doors, and only those who knew the secret words could open them. Egypt wasn't alone in its obsession with the gates of the afterlife, where the Egyptians filled tombs with maps and spells to cross rivers of fire and terrible guardians. Other civilizations imagined even more personal trials, trials that couldn't be overcome just with magic words, but by leaving behind something much harder to abandon: power, pride, ego. Now let's travel to the ancient lands of Mesopotamia, where the gates to the underworld weren't just physical, but spiritual, where the descent was an act of stripping away, a reminder that death equalizes everyone, even the gods. Mesopotamia, the 7 gates. In Mesopotamia, the underworld wasn't a place for negotiations or easy promises. It was a realm with absolute rules, governed by Ereshkigal, the goddess of death, and populated by shadowy spirits. Its most famous story is the descent of Inanna, the powerful goddess of love and war. Inanna decides to descend to the underworld, but to do so, she must pass through 7 gates. At each one, she is forced to remove something sacred: her crown, her scepter, her royal robes. With every step, she loses a symbol of her power and her divine identity. When she finally stands before Ereshkigal, Inanna is naked and vulnerable. She is judged and dies, hung on a hook like a simple corpse. But this isn't just a tale of hopeless punishment. With divine help, Inanna is resurrected and returns to the world of the living, changed, reborn. This myth, found on cuneiform tablets over 4,000 years old, is considered one of the oldest stories of descent and rebirth in the world. It later inspired the idea of catabasis in Greek literature and is seen as a universal archetype, the journey to the underworld as transformation. Scholars see in the seven gates a psychological symbol. To face death or oneself, one must strip away all pride, all worldly power. Nothing can be taken to the other side. In the ruins of Ur and other Sumerian cities, cylinders and seals have been found with images of Inanna, of gates, and of descent rituals. Proof that this myth wasn't just told, but was a living part of their religion and art. For the Mesopotamians, the gates to the underworld weren't simple passages. They were warnings, metaphors for death as the ultimate equalizer, a lesson in humility that not even the gods could avoid. Although the stories of gods and descents teach us lessons about pride, fear, and rebirth, there's something even more unsettling. Many of those places actually exist. Places marked on maps, described by ancient historians, and explored by modern archaeologists. Spaces where nature itself seemed to conspire to create the perfect stage for a myth, where gases, echoes, or unfathomable depths became living proof that the underworld wasn't just imagination. Let's now explore those archaeological mysteries, those natural explanations that, far from destroying the legend, made it even more powerful. Archaeological mysteries and natural explanation. Not every myth is born purely from imagination. Many of these supposed portals to the underworld are anchored in real places where nature seemed to conspire to inspire fear and awe. The Plutonion of Hierapolis in modern-day Turkey is one of the most unsettling examples. This Greco-Roman sanctuary was dedicated to Pluto, lord of the underworld. It contained a small cave from which an invisible and deadly gas emanated, pure carbon dioxide. The ancients said that death was palpable there. Animals thrown inside died within seconds. Yet the priests, aware of the phenomenon, learned to walk upright to avoid the denser layers of gas and emerged unharmed. For the faithful, this was proof of their sacred power. In 2013, an archaeological study from the University of Salento confirmed this lethality. CO2 emissions were constant, killing any small creature at the entrance. The ancients didn't understand the science, but they saw the result. A real doorway to the world of the dead. Lake Avernus in Italy offers another fascinating case. Its name comes from the Greek ionos, meaning without birds, because it was said no bird could fly over it without falling dead. Its sulfurous waters and toxic vapors have been seeping since Roman times, fueling the legend that it was one of the entrances to Hades. Virgil himself, in his Aeneid, describes Aeneas traveling there to consult with his dead father in the underworld. Pliny the Elder mentioned it in his chronicles, describing the deadly gases and local beliefs. It was a living warning. Here, the earth breathes poison. In Greece, there were caves like those at Cape Tainaran and the Oracles of the Dead, where visitors descended through narrow, dark tunnels. Many archaeologists believe those spaces used narcotic substances or semi-asphyxiating conditions to induce visions. The walls, with their natural acoustics, returned whispers and echoes that seemed like voices from beyond. Excavations at the Necromanteon of Epirus revealed complex systems of chambers and passages designed to disorient initiates, heightening suggestion and fear. Even in the Americas, the Mayan Cenotes offered a terrifying and sacred setting. Many contained human bones, sometimes of children, along with jade, fine ceramics, and gold. These offerings weren't symbolic. They were real payments to subterranean deities. Researchers like Guillermo de Anda, an INE explorer in Mexico, have mapped cenotes with dozens of skeletons, proving these sacrifices were systematic. They were living gates, devourers of souls, where people bargained with the unknown. But here arises the unsettling question. Did nature itself create these places to remind us of our limits? To tell us there are spaces not meant for the living? Because for the ancients, these gases, these echoes, these deep and silent waters, weren't natural explanations. They were proof that the other world existed, that the earth itself was capable of opening to show us the beyond. And perhaps even today, when science explains their causes, it doesn't completely erase that chill. Because even when science reveals the secrets of these places, something remains. They aren't just cracks in the rock or toxic vapors. They are warnings carved by nature itself to remind us of a boundary, the passage between what we know and what we can't control. And that's where their true power begins. Because these gates weren't just physical places, they were symbols, maps of the human soul. Now let's explore the symbolic and spiritual dimension of the gates to the underworld, those stories that tell us more about ourselves than about the earth we walk on. Symbolic and spiritual dimension. The gates to the underworld were never just a stone, water, or fire. They were symbols, warnings about the most universal and inevitable journey, the passage into the unknown. In every culture, these gates marked the boundary between life and death, but also between order and chaos, the known and the unexplored. They were liminal places, sacred and dangerous spaces where normal rules no longer applied. For many peoples, these gates didn't just represent literal death, but transformation. The act of giving up everything that defines us to discover who we are without our titles, wealth, or power. In Mesopotamia, Inanna's descent wasn't just a myth about gods. It was a mirror of human experience, leaving the ego behind to be reborn. Each gate she crossed stripped something away until she was vulnerable and had nothing left. In Egypt, the Duat wasn't merely a place of punishment, but of spiritual trials. Overcoming them meant earning eternal life. The Book of the Dead isn't a book of horror, but a manual of spiritual wisdom. It taught that knowing the sacred names, understanding the laws of the other world, was knowing oneself. Even in the Bible, Sheol was a cold reminder that no one escapes death. It was the common destiny of all, an inevitable gate that equalized king and beggar alike. In many shamanic traditions, the journey to the underworld isn't just a metaphor. Shamans truly induced altered states to travel to realms of the dead and bring back knowledge or healing. For them, the gates to the underworld were gates of wisdom. Anthropologists call these places liminal spaces, where identity is broken down to be rebuilt, where one confronts the deepest fear, the end of oneself. Because in the end, perhaps that's what these gates were. Not just entrances to death, but calls to reflect on life, to ask ourselves, what are we willing to leave behind? What part of us must die so another can be born? In this way, these gates to the underworld weren't just geographical markers or archaeological remnants, but maps of the human soul. Relics of a spiritual language that still speaks to us if we have the courage to listen. Even when we reduce these gates to symbols, something still unsettles us. Because even if we call them myths or metaphors, many feel that those thresholds never fully closed. And the question persists, what if they weren't just spiritual warnings? What if they were descriptions, imperfect but sincere, of something we still don't fully understand? Now let's delve into the modern and paranormal theories that suggest these gates to the underworld might be more than just memories of human fear. That perhaps they're still open, modern and paranormal. Theories. Today, the ancient gates to the underworld still fascinate us. They're no longer worshipped with sacrifices or spells. But many still wonder if those places hold secrets. There are theories about dimensional portals, suggesting certain sites have unique physical properties, magnetic anomalies, alterations in time or space. So-called energy vortices, like those mentioned in Sedona, Arizona, or certain points in the Andes, are studied for supposed unusual concentrations of energy that some claim to feel as a threshold. Places once marked as cursed on old maps are now investigated by scientists and mystery enthusiasts alike. Some claim unexplained phenomena happened there. Electronic malfunctions, changes in perception, strange sounds, sightings of shadows or entities. In Turkey, near the Plutonion of Hierapolis, modern studies have shown that the deadly gases still rise just as they did 2,000 years ago. A geological phenomenon, but also a physical reminder of why the ancients feared those cracks. In Mexico, divers in cenotes have found underwater passages so labyrinthine they seem designed to get people lost. Some claim to feel presences as they explore the flooded caverns, and even though science explains poisonous gases, strange acoustics, or geological formations, many places continue to feed local legends. Entire villages still refuse to go near caves or lakes considered cursed, because even though we have words like carbon dioxide, resonance, or sulfur, we haven't completely stripped them of their character as thresholds. In the end, perhaps these gates to the underworld are more than ancient warnings. Perhaps they are points where our world grows thin, where we remember there are forces and fears we still don't fully understand. And maybe that's precisely why they attract us so much. Perhaps the gates to the underworld were never sealed. Perhaps they're still breathing in deep cracks and forgotten caverns, in black waters where light refuses to enter, places where the earth opens like an ancient wound, reminding us that not everything is under our control, where the silence feels heavy as if something else is listening. Because in the end, these gates are more than stone or water. They're mirrors of our deepest fear, the end, the unknown, the inevitable. They whisper that there are limits we shouldn't cross, secrets that perhaps no one should learn. And yet, they attract us. They call to us with a dark song that promises power, knowledge, or damnation. What if they were never empty warnings? Or what if they are maps, drawn by those who saw something they didn't want to forget, but couldn't bear to remember? Ask yourself, would you dare to enter? To open that door knowing you'd never be the same when you came back out? Perhaps those gates are still open. We just prefer to look the other way. Or maybe we've simply forgotten how to find them. If this journey made you think, subscribe to Código Divino. Share this video with those who dare to explore the forbidden. And tell me in the comments, are these gates just legends or warnings still waiting patiently to be heard? Because here we don't just tell stories, we summon the echoes of mystery. Until our next descent into the shadows,